because Darwin had estimated in the origin that it might take hundreds of millions of years for his process of descent with modification to generate this immense tree of life. So Darwin wanted 400 million years, tenfold more than Lord Kelvin thought was physically possible. So this debate was actually resolved by an amazing series of discoveries in 20th century physics that Darwin didn't live to see. Einstein realized in the earliest 20th century that energy and mass are actually interconvertible. His famous equation, E equals mc squared, E for energy and m for mass. Detailed measurements of the actual mass of atoms shows that 4 hydrogen atoms actually weigh slightly more than 1 helium atom. And the way the sun actually shines is a process of fusion energy. So 4 hydrogen atoms are fused together to make 1 helium, and a small bit of excess mass is converted into energy. So the sun is a nuclear furnace, not the kind of conventional furnace that Kelvin had modeled in the 1800s. You can actually measure the amount of hydrogen and helium in the sun and calculate how old the sun must be based on that nuclear furnace. Similarly, around the turn of the century, radioactivity was discovered for the first time. So that actually provided a new source of heat within rocks, and it also provided a brand new way to calculate the absolute age of rocks. Detailed measurements from both the physics of stars and the half-life of radioactive decay show that the Earth and the solar system are billions of years old, not millions of years old, so 100 times longer than Lord Kelvin had estimated during the debates with Darwin. So when Darwin said that an infinite number of generations, which the mind can't grasp, must have succeeded each other in the long roll of years, he was even more right than he thought at the time. Okay, how about the fossil record? Well, the fossil record has always been imperfect. Darwin worried about this in the origin. As soon as the origin was published, lots of interesting fossils started to be published, and that's been true ever since. In 1861, 2 years after the origin appeared, a spectacular fossil was found. This was the first of several Archaeopteryx fossils. Remarkable preservation of feather structures in an ancient reptile. So Archaeopteryx has traits of both birds and reptiles. You can see feathers, but it's on an ancient reptile that still has teeth, structures that are normally never found in modern birds. This kind of fossil with a mixture of traits of different organisms was exactly the kind of fossil that Darwin's theory of descent with modification predicted must exist. Well, key fossil discoveries have kept being made ever since the origin. One of the biggest gaps in the fossil record that Darwin worried a lot about was the complete absence of any known fossils in Precambrian strata. So the fossil record, as Darwin knew it, the first appearance of fossil life in the record at that time, by the time the fossils appeared, they were already complex and diverse. No record of simple forms that Darwin proposed must exist at the base of his immense tree of life. Since the origin, the fossil evidence of life on Earth has been pushed back in spectacular ways. Fossils of simple single-celled organisms have now been confirmed in rocks that are billions of years old, shown there in the figure at the top. Just as Darwin predicted, the early forms of life are much simpler than the complex life that's seen later, when the early fossil record looks like mats of bacteria, cyanobacteria, and single-celled microorganisms. Similarly, since 1859, the earliest forms of multicellular life have also been found in the fossil record. These also occur in rocks that predate the explosion of more complex forms in the Cambrian. So, unicellular life in billions of years old rocks, the earliest forms of multicellular life in Precambrian rocks, and in addition, many transitional fossils have been now been found for higher animal groups. So let's go much later in the fossil record and talk about the reinvasion of water by mammals. We're used to thinking of vertebrates as land animals with skeletal structures that are appropriate for walking around on 2 or 4 legs on land. Most mammals, that's true, but in fact some mammals are found in the ocean as aquatic organisms. They have streamlined bodies, such as seen here in a manatee. So manatees have a streamlined body. They still have 2 forefins or flippers, but they no longer have hind limbs. Right? So they also have a series of other aquatic adaptations. Nostrils that are located high up on the head for breathing at the water-air interface. Very unusual downturned jaws that are only seen in manatees and a closely related animal called dugongs. Unusual ribs. So most animals have ribs that are hollow, filled with bone marrow. In manatees and dugongs, the ribs are actually solid. They're filled with bone. That's thought to serve as a form of ballast for these marine creatures. And finally, in addition to those features, manatees show some characteristics that suggest they may have evolved from land animals. That includes both toenails on their flippers and vestigial hind limbs. So this shows a blow-up of a manatee flipper. You can see out at the ends these toenails. It's very unusual because toenails are usually only found on land animals. This was recognized a long time ago. The manatee's toenails actually look very much like elephant toenails. DNA studies show that the DNA of manatees and the DNA of elephants is more closely related than most other mammals. So it looks like these may have evolved from four-legged creatures. In addition, although manatees don't have hind limbs, if you look at their skeleton, they do have tiny rudimentary pelvic bones where a hind limb would normally be found. Okay, these aren't attached to the vertebral column. They can't support weight. There's no leg that comes off of the pelvis. Surprisingly, those rudimentary pelvic bones do still have a tiny hip socket, even though the femur isn't there. We actually have a manatee bone. I'll put it up here at the front and invite you to come up during the break. This is the small rudimentary pelvis of a manatee. You see a little circle here. This is a vestigial hip socket for a ghost femur that's no longer there. Again, that's just like the vestigial eyes in cave organisms, the example of a kind of structure that's very hard to explain if manatees had been designed from scratch to live in the ocean. On the other hand, those kinds of structures are easy to explain if manatees actually evolved from four-legged precursors. Well, if manatees evolved from four-legged land animals, where are the supposed fossils of intermediate forms? Well, the fossils are actually in Jamaica. Very interesting paper that was published in 2001 by Dr. Domning from the Howard University here in the Washington, D.C. area. He described a spectacular fossil that was found in 50-million-year-old deposits in Jamaica. This nearly complete skeleton shows all sorts of characteristic diagnostic manatee features, including the nostrils up on the top of the head, characteristic solid ballast-like ribs, the unusual downturned jaws that are only found in manatees and dugongs. Despite having all these features, it has another very interesting feature. It still has hind limbs. So the hind limbs are present, and they look just as robust as the forelimbs. So exactly the kind of organism for evolving manatees from a previous four-legged ancestor. Other intermediate stages in pelvic reduction have been found for this group. Manatees and dugongs belong to a group called the Sirenia, and other proto-Sirenia fossils have been shown that show intermediate stages of hind limb reduction. Here's a fossil. You can see the hind limbs are present, but they're now much smaller than the forelimbs. You still have a pelvis, a femur, and the lower leg bones. So we have now a fossil record that goes all the way from a complete four-legged looking manatee to things that have intermediate pelvic reduction, and then the simple vestigial pelvis that's still found in the modern forms.